Brothers and sisters, welcome to the Son of the North podcast. I am your host, Rex, serving as your guiding light through the darkness of this age. This is the 9th episode of the Son of the North podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to follow us on Spotify, Google Podcasts, YouTube, BitChute, and all other platforms where podcasts can be found. Also make sure to follow me, Rex, on Instagram at the handle Son of Diaus. I'm sure many of you have been waiting for episode 9 for quite a long time now, so let's get into today's show without any further delay.
Ха-ха, братка мой, той повинен был бачить хрудзи и шони хетай зачни. Я набил я, понобдая на бігометр.
Вельми добрий, брат, вельми добрий. Скажіть, кому ви най забрали яє назад у наш лагер? Мой завсёди малий використувач видною замкню. Каб отримвяч аслоду ад паслія ще закага.
Брат, я не забрав я назад, бо я напачла горш за моє коня.
О, хорошо, хорошо.
Молчание. Привнак, я буду стрелять.
Ah, forgive me if I startled you fellows. You'll have to excuse me. It has been a while since I've seen a Koryos in these lands. I am but a wandering poet. I assure you I mean no harm. Scyth, Slav, or Goth, I am friend to all who call the steppes home. Ah, I see you've slacked your arrow. Much obliged, friend. While I would be happy to live on through my stories, it is not yet my time to leave this mortal realm to join Yemo in the underworld. May I take a seat by your fire?
Да.
Wonderful. I can assure you you shan't regret my company. I must admit, you were able to draw a bead on me so swiftly. Surely you are the finest archer I have encountered in a long while. Why, I would bet your tribe's pantries overflow with the finest game. Yes, many a talented archer has been born under these stars. For the bow is the greatest lifeline for a son of the steppes. Oh, in all honesty, I pity the generations of city dwellers who have found their ends skewered on the arrows of our brethren. As a thanks for your company and for letting me find warmth around your fire, I will tell you the story of perhaps the greatest of such bowmen. A son of the steppes who was feared like no other. One labeled by his urbanite enemies as the Scourge of God, a warrior unlike any other, appointed by Dyaus himself to rule over this world. Alas, this fate was never fully realized, for the champion's hubris and fiery approach led him astray from the solar path. But the warrior and his deeds live on in legend, and his story contains many valuable lessons for our young brave warriors, such as yourselves. Long, long ago, the many branches of our ancestral tree had set out from the steppes. Atop their chariots, none could stop them on the warpath. The conquering heroes chose for themselves the most prosperous of kingdoms. But as is the nature of the ages, time corrupts all. Of the descendants of these tribes, the gods had fated for the sons of the she-wolf to rise above their brothers and to bring untold glory to their ancestors. The Romans fought and conquered, spreading the worship of Dyaus and Sol across the known world. But as I said earlier, time corrupts all, and in time all great empires must fall. In their success, the sons of the she-wolf fell to hubris and ignored their religious duties to the gods and to their ancestors. The corrupting grasp of the adversaries seduced these noble men of the solar bloodline, and their domain suffered for it. The noble and tragic Aurelian, a son of Sol himself, rose amongst them to restore the ancestral traditions and to raise his tribe out of chaos. But the cancer spread throughout Rome by the adversaries had already corrupted the jealous hearts of his kinsmen, and Aurelian, the son of Sol, was betrayed. It had been over a century since Aurelian's betrayal, a mere second in the timeline of the gods. The once proud and united two-headed eagle now fought against itself and split. The noble sons of the she-wolf, once such pious preservers of the ancestral tradition, now prostrated themselves to a foreign god, a mere carpenter. The neglect and profaning of Dyaus' temple atop the Capitoline Hill could not be ignored. Time corrupts all, and the gods had fated that Rome had lost the mantle of sovereignty. For their hubris, Rome would fall and burn. Out on the steppes, a most auspicious event was about to occur. Man, animals, and gods alike gathered to see the birth of the new Rex, a king fated to bite off the head of the eagle and to rule over all the tribes of Arias. A sign of his destiny, the boy came out of his mother clasping Bloodclot tightly in hand, an omen most auspicious to a Kshatriya. It was a sign that he was to restore order to the many tribes of the solar bloodline. When that babe's cries first echoed out from the royal tent, all knelt in obeisance, in fear of the man he was to be. Attila, they called him, breaker of horses, breaker of proud men, the scourge of the Christ God. The boy was raised on the great Pannonian steppe. He came to know the harsh winds and the whistling of arrows. In time, that boy became a mighty warrior, unlike that ever seen by his people. With the death of his uncle Rugila, Attila and his brother Bleda assumed the mantle of the growing Hunnic Empire. The brothers moved on Constantinople, seeking to extort the weakened eagle. The cowering, fearful Romans of the East accepted humiliating terms, deep down knowing that the marble pillars they neglected could not stop the coming tidal wave from the steppes. With his heart filled with envy and animosity, those symptoms so prone to those who worship the adversaries, the coward Emperor Theodosius mobilized his people and built a wall around his imperial estate. Indeed, Attila and his brother struck fear into the hearts of most rulers on this earth. But a lion is not keen to share his throne. There may be only one alpha in a wolf pack. Hunnic raids continued to plunder the urban centers, cleansing them of the corrupting touch of the adversaries through fire and steel. Late himself would succumb to a mysterious wound. Attila alone now ruled over the Huns and their great confederacy. Many tribes of Goths, Scyths, and Slavs alike joined forces with the Huns. Deep down they recognized Attila's divine appointment. Attila too knew of the destiny that the gods had set before him. He had physical proof. Within Attila's domain, a shepherd had noticed that one of his flock had cut himself out in the field. The shepherd investigated the field, only to find the most remarkable blade stabbed into the earth itself. The shepherd sent word to his liege, and Attila came to claim the divine blade for himself, the sword of soul, the sword of the gods. This blade had been sent to Attila by Diaus, Sol, and the gods of our ancestors. It would, for centuries, strike fear into the heart of all men corrupted by the adversaries. The Romans, who had not so long ago turned against the traditions of their ancestors, also recognized that the blade was sent by gods other than the Christ, a sign of their demise. The Sword of Mars, they called it, for surely this was a blade worthy of their old god of war. The weapon thirsted for the blood of all deniers of the steppe gods, the true gods of our ancestors. The gods in the heavens had sent Attila a sign. For their hubris and the denial of their ancestors, those Romans, that double-headed eagle, would have to be slain. The blade spoke to Attila, delivering a message from Diaus himself. He was to rule this whole world, to cleanse the earth from those who prostrated themselves to the adversaries. Like lightning, Attila and his nomadic forces struck fast and hard. They first clipped the eagle's eastern wings, with wall after wall, city after city, denier after denier, all falling to the horde. A few eastern soldiers, true sons of Rome doomed by the folly of their leaders, were in awe to see Jupiter himself fighting alongside the Huns from the distant heavens. Devout to the traditions of their ancestors till the end, they knew that, like all fathers, the Sky Father had to punish his rebellious children. The Roman bureaucrats and aristocracy, so addicted to the poison spewed by the mouthpieces of sadistic gods, silenced these true sons of Rome. They recognized that their denial of the gods had brought about Rome's doom. They suppressed this ancient knowledge, controlling all textual accounts and news of the Huns, so that the citizens of the empire would not know how their ancestral gods had disowned them. The adversaries played their hands from the shadows. They recognized that this nomadic champion of the gods threatened their plans and ambitions. City after city fell to the Huns, and their network of subversion and manipulation was disconnected. Those spiteful and angry gods that dwelt beneath the surface writhed and raged from their hidden chambers. But, despite his imperfections, the adversary is not without strength. As is the nature of cowards, the adversaries knew that retreat behind their walls would allow them to preserve Constantinople, the seat of their power, the malignant tumor of the adversarial cancer upon this earth. Seeking to fulfill the destiny given to him by the Sky Father, Attila and his armies punished the denier for his transgression against the ancestral gods. But, being a mere mortal, Attila was unable to break Constantinople's walls, for they were reinforced by dark and ancient protective magics, evil curses cast by the adversaries to protect their puppets. Invoking the name of the slain serpent Ngui, the adversaries channeled all of their dark and unholy energies into protecting the city, for it was a key investment in their long-term plan to defeat our gods. If Constantinople fell, so too would the chances of their victory. Attila tried again and again, but the city would not fall. The gods watched on, knowing that, for the nomad to fulfill his destiny, this trial would have to be passed alone, without divine intervention. With the East's supply lines and treasuries stretched thin, it was only a matter of time before a weak point, a chink in the armor of the eagle, presented itself. But Attila, his senses so clouded by his blade's lust for blood, was unable to face this trial with a calm and level head. Now, there's an important lesson in this for you, my friends. A warrior's blade may thirst for blood and gore, but his mind and heart must thirst for Dharma, duty. The desire to crush one's enemies might be best in life, but if such passion and emotion clouds one's sense of duty, then they will be robbed of the calm mind needed to prevail in battle. If you let rage, hatred, and desire for vengeance distract you from your fulfillment of Dharma, then you will be unable to fulfill your destiny and do what is best for your tribe. Only by knowing and mastering one's anger and wrath can a Kshatriya truly wield these emotions for the purpose of fulfilling his destiny. Like the blending of the primordial cosmic essences, the unconquerable warrior maintains balance within himself. His muscles, so bound to their duty of hacking and slashing by memory, radiate Diaus's warmth like the fires of a hearth. But like a hearth, one cannot let their internal fire get out of control, lest it burn your tent to the ground. To balance the raging inferno inside oneself, the mind of the warrior must be calm, cool, and collected, like the primordial cold of the Earth Mother. As Diaus's warmth balances Dagom's cold, so too must the warrior balance a fiery spirit with a cool mind. Only then can the sparks of his inner divinity be stoked. Only then can he fulfill his duty and approach his destiny. Attila could not resist the whisperings of his blade. He too longed to see the deaths of all of those who had betrayed the Lord of the Sky. All of those who, by proxy, had betrayed the memory of their ancestors. His inability to manifest a cool mind would be his fatal flaw. Another important lesson, brothers. An injured enemy is not soon to forget the offense against him. He will lick his wounds and bide his time. The adversaries were spiteful to Attila for his meddling in their schemes. Speaking through the guise of Roman and Gothic servants to the king, the adversaries took advantage of his tragic flaw and continued to stoke his inner fire, trying to redirect his anger away from their most important fortress. In the end, Attila was persuaded to move his armies west, seduced by the prospect of biting off the eagle's other head. Our gods watched on from the heavens, disappointed in Attila's inability to temper his mind and spirit. They knew that this plan was misguided, and that Constantinople's fall would be the biggest setback for the adversaries. Attila's weakness did not anger them, for all was not lost if Attila's personal flaws prevented him from achieving his true destiny. The great conflict that is to be at the end of the Kali Yuga was not yet in sight. The adversaries were not yet fated to fall. Sol, the grand strategist of the heavens, spoke to the gods and advised them that to fully invest their efforts in this battle could lose them the war. The great solar mystic imparted a great lesson this day and alleviated the fears of the gods. new champions would always arise among the sons of Arias. Some would be victorious and force the adversaries to adjust their strategy. Some would succumb to their personal weaknesses and fail tragically. Even in loss, these champions would inspire future generations of heroes. In times of darkness, children of the solar bloodline would always create light. With their efforts focused on the greater cosmic war, rather than the outcome of this particular conflict, the gods watched Attila's tragedy unfold from a distance. Attila's neglect of Dharma ensured that he would never fulfill his destiny. As the nomadic warlord marched his armies westward, the adversaries also met in discussion, plotting their next move. As is their nature, the different factions of the adversaries squabbled over how to best exploit the tragic hero's impatience and attachments to the fruits of his labors. Many adversaries had structured their schemes through the Eastern Empire, whereas others had plotted against our gods using the Western Empire, and some employed the Christianized Goths to their purposes. While the adversaries may be united in their hatred for our people and our ancestral gods, they are not themselves a united front. This perhaps explains the sometimes conflicting nature of the events brought about by the schemes of the adversaries. They all seek to destroy our gods, but they are divided on the approach for doing so. Chief among the eastern faction of the adversaries was Ishtar, a goddess associated with sensual lust, seduction, wrath, and war. A rival of the great soul, she had let hostility and bitterness ferment in her heart. For her ambitions to spread her influence through her puppet Zenobia had been foiled by Soul's last great champion. She now longed for personal revenge against the gods and to crush the ambitions of their current champion. She decided to play to her strengths, and through dark and demonic arts possessed one of the many vessels bred to allow the adversaries to directly interfere in the affairs of humans. She possessed Honoria, sister of Valentinian III, Emperor of the crumbling West. As cunning as she is vicious, Ishtar found a way to bring down the rival Western faction while also hastening Attila's demise. She played to her strengths in beauty and seduction, writing a letter to the Hunnic king, asking for him to invade West Rome to rescue her from her weak brother. She imbued within the letter irresistible charms powered by her ancient dark magics. Attila was helpless to resist. Blinded by his lust for blood and supple flesh, Attila convinced himself that he now had a just cause to begin his campaign against Western Rome. This was his greatest act of hubris, for what is more insulting to the gods than for a mortal to attempt to justify his carnal desires as his divine duty? While he was neglecting his Dharma, Attila's strength and ability was unquestionable. The warlord and his armies plundered through Gaul, razing city after city to the ground. The gods watched on, disappointed in the hubris of their former champion. Gaul burned, and, distracted by apparent victory, Attila was further and further corrupted by the poisonous words of the adversaries. In his folly, he attempted to destroy the holy city of Aurelianum, founded by the great solar champion Aurelian himself. This was the straw that broke the camel's backs. The gods could no longer support Attila. He had fallen astray from the solar path. An act of divine intervention, Aurelianum withstood Attila's armies. Attila's ambitions were fated to be crushed at the nearby Catalonian plains, the same sacred field of battle where the noble Aurelian had defeated the Gallic usurpers and restored his empire. Before battle, Attila consulted the shamans and diviners he employed. Loyal servants of the gods, they had recognized the king's ill-fated attempts to confuse his Dharma with his desires. They performed their rituals only to confirm their suspicions. The gods had abandoned Attila. If war was to be waged that day, the Hunnic king would not be fighting for duty. A king who sends his men to their deaths while neglecting his duty only brings despair and misery to his tribe. Blinded by his rage and lust, Attila committed a final act of hubris and ignored the advice of his shamans. The Hunnic army would wage war that day. There is no glory in an unrighteous battle, for without the direction of Dharma, a battle is lost to chaos. Indeed, the Battle of the Catalonian Plains was quite chaotic. On all sides, many noble sons of Arias were slain. Many ancient solar bloodlines lost forever to the whims of the adversaries and corrupted men. Goth, Celt, Frank, Saxon, Alan, Hun, and Roman. Many sparks of divinity were snuffed out in those blood-soaked fields. While it is difficult to conclude which side had lost, the adversaries had certainly won. Attila had been dealt a massive blow to his pride and his ego, which had been so inflated by the stoking of the adversaries. Within his royal tent in his camp, for the first time in his life, the Hunnic king trembled in fear. Deep down within his heart, he knew that the gods were not with him that day in battle. His mind was tortured with existential dread. Was I not to achieve my fated glory? The last glimpse of his noble spark briefly pierced the corrupting murk of the adversaries. Out of sheer desperation to fulfill his glory and hopefully regain the favor of the gods, Attila pressed what remained of his forces towards northern Italy. He continued to burn down the corrupted Roman cities and demanded that Honoria be delivered to him, all the while anxious over his apparent abandonment by the gods. Desperate to achieve his destiny, Attila had his armies make camp at the sacred lake of Benacus. At Benacus, the tormented Hun pondered his fate and his next move to make. To make matters worse, he had been informed that the cowardly Emperor Valentinian sent not his sister, but 3 envoys to him to establish peace, including the Pope of Rome, Leo I. Attila roared in frustration. He feared of further upsetting the gods by humoring the high priest of the carpenter. In the dark of the night, Attila snuck away from his guarded tents, wearing only a cloak. He escaped his encampment and headed towards the sacred lake. The Hunnic warrior sought a sign from the gods, desperately seeking divine inspiration for his next move. He crept along the marshy banks of the great lake until he came upon a large hidden grotto. Attila had learned from Roman captives that the ancestors of the Romans had treated grottos such as this as holy places, and so entered into the cave, seeking the divine. He emulated the ritual that he had seen his shamans perform many times, seeking contact with some spirit or divinity that would provide guidance. Failing in his attempt to imitate the priestly duty, the desperate hero then assumed a meditative pose and began to channel his focus inward. He closed his eyes and tuned out his senses, timing his breath with the occasional dripping of water from the cavern rocks. After a while, he heard a soft and faint voice whispering on the winds, "Go to Rome." Inspired by his meditations, Attila rejected to meet the Roman envoys. he instead advised his commanders to dress up one of his retainers, a clever Germanic Lombard warrior named Garda, as himself, and to present the envoys to the youth as if the youth were Attila himself. Attila, meanwhile, would dress in the attire of a vagabond and quickly ride south to Rome, pursuing the divine instructions he had been given. Garda, who was eternally loyal to Attila, would end up playing the part perfectly. While a devotee of Wotan, Garda had been raised among Christian Goths and knew of the Christian obsession with theological debate and grandstanding. Playing on this compulsion, the pretend Attila brilliantly goaded the zealous Pope Leo into long obsessive rants on Christian doctrine, providing his liege enough time to reach Rome and return. For his cleverness and fulfillment of his duties to his liege, Garda brought much honor to his tribe. The Lombards, who conquered northern Italy centuries later, would go on to found a small town on the shores of the lake, and rename the town and lake after Garda in recognition of his great feat of trickery, an act that paved the way for his tribe to claim the former Roman heartlands. Riding swiftly on his horse, Attila rode on day and night until he reached Rome. The Rome he saw was but a shell of its former glory, with many of its magnificent ancient halls and temples being overgrown and stripped of marble for the use in construction of new churches. The disguised warlord wandered through the eternal city, pondering its past glories and its fall from the favor of the gods. No longer did the roars of triumph echo through her streets. Now only the sounds of drunkards and church bells rang out. How did it come to this, he wondered. As he wandered, he felt more and more assured in his conviction to raise the city. While his original intention had been to destroy Rome out of spite and bloodlust, he now thought to himself that he owed it to the great people of Rome's past to spare the city from any further degeneration. His mission seemingly accomplished, and his convictions reassured, Attila decided to visit one last destination, the crumbling temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, to pay his respects to the eternal Lord of the sky. Attila climbed the temple's steps, and he found amidst the ruins all sorts of squalor, plebs and livestock resting in the corners of the once hallowed hall. Meanwhile, some men carved out blocks from the temple walls and began to haul them off, presumably for use elsewhere. Attila rushed at them in protest, but its words fell on deaf ears, filled with the poisonous words of meekness and complacency. This enraged the Khan. How could the Romans do this in the house of Dios? How could they commit such an act that would surely upset their pious ancestors? The bewildered warrior sat himself down on the temple steps. His ears perked up at the sound of a raven's call. He turned his head to see a great raven atop the remnants of a marble pillar. The raven's bright eyes locked with his own gaze. The warlord found himself unable to look away, and a great sense of fear overcame him. He felt a warm pulsing within his head, and heard a voice speak out to him. "What brings you to my domain, Attila? Do you seek to level what has already been neglected by privileged fools?" Sensing the overwhelming presence of Dios Pater, the nomad dropped to one knee in reverence before the eternal Lord of the sky. "I seek only guidance, O great Father of the gods." The powerful voice boomed again from deep within him. What guidance does one at the end of the road set before him need? Your hubris and neglect of spiritual duty has departed you from the great solar path, and for this you have been barred from the glorious destiny you seek. Attila reflected on these words. he came to understand the God's message from deep within his heart. Tears rose to his eyes, but he felt at peace. And what of Rome? Are the arrogant fools not to be punished for their sullying of ancestral tradition? Attila asked. Indeed, the betraying of one's ancestors cannot go unpunished. The Romans, in their hubris, have forgotten that their past glories stem from noble deeds, and no action can be noble if it is not performed in the fulfillment of one's Dharma. While the Romans are fools, ancient and eternal Rome herself is a city favored by the gods. Her monuments and ruins have a role to play in stoking the fires within the hearts of those of noble blood for generations to come. Tell me, Attila, O Lord of the Steppes, will you, in greed and pride, rob the Kshatriya of their chance for a glorious destiny? The harsh reality of the god's words sank in. The Hun softly sobbed, I shall not, great father. Suddenly, Attila felt a great warmth radiate and expand from within his heart. The tears shrank from his eyes, and his soul felt at peace. Fear not, my son. Though you have been barred from the fate you were once promised, your glorious victories on the battlefield shall not go unrecognized by future generations. Even those who have been brought to the brink by the corruption of the adversaries can still find some redemption if they act in the best interest of their descendants. Now, leave this place. Return home to the steppes. With the fear plaguing his heart no longer, Attila left Rome, having found the answers he sought. In the thick of the night, he returned to his encamped armies and swapped places with his doppelganger and sent the Roman envoy on their way, making clear his intention to retreat from Italy. Pope Leo, so arrogant in his convictions and in his inflated sense of ability, came to believe that it was his words that had dissuaded Attila from destroying Rome. The funny reality being that Attila had not heard a single word spoke forth from the priest's mouth. Indeed, it was the words of the true god, the great diurnal father Dios, that had swayed the heart of the savage. With his armies in tow, the great warlord Attila retreated from the European heartland and returned home to the steppes of the east. He released many of his Germanic vassals along the way, inspiring them to stride forward and to pursue righteous glory at the tip of spear and sword. Attila's fate after this withdrawal is the subject of much mystery. Some claimed that the hubristic warrior died not in battle, but from a nosebleed at a great feast. Others claimed that he died at the end of the blade of a bride he forced to be his conquest. Some say that the Khan merely relinquished his throne to his eldest son, and all alone set out on a pilgrimage to the very heart of the steppes. Did the corrupted warrior find the redemption he desperately sought? Or did he die a humiliating, unrighteous death, like the death of all of those who reject Dharma? We may never know, but we do know one thing for sure. The name of Attila and of his ferocious Huns drives fear into the heart of the adversaries, into the heart of all of those who reject our ancestral ways. Hello, my friends. This is Rex. The topic of today's episode of the Son of the North podcast is the infamous warlord Attila the Hun. But who is Attila, and who were these Huns that he commanded? According to the pages of history, The Huns were members of a warlike nomadic culture that invaded the crumbling remnants of the dying Roman Empire during the 4th century AD. To modern scholars, the Huns are largely a historical mystery. They quickly appeared onto the European historical scene at the end of the Classical era, and just as quickly disappeared after the death of their infamous king, Attila. As far as we know, the Huns had no written language and left behind no written records from which we could have first-hand accounts of their practices and traditions. What we do know about the Huns ultimately stems from Roman historical sources, which were obviously biased against this cultural force that was invading their empire. Despite these biases, we should not necessarily discount the Roman historical sources, for there seems to be many grains of truth within these biased accounts. For example, many descriptions of the Huns and observations about their culture described in the works of the Gothic historian Jordanes can actually be confirmed and corroborated with modern archaeological evidence. So, what can we say for certain about such a mysterious culture? It is quite obvious that the Huns themselves were nomads originating in the Eurasian steppe. The homeland of this mysterious ancient tribe is a heated topic of debate amongst many scholars of medieval history. Given that the Huns were sometimes described as having an Asiatic appearance in Roman historical sources, some scholars propose that the Huns were related to the ancient Xiongnu culture that harassed the ancient Chinese Han dynasty between the 3rd century BC and the 2nd century AD. The Xiongnu controlled a vast steppe empire made up of territories that are now contained in the modern nation-states of Mongolia, northern China, Kazakhstan, and Russia. According to Chinese historical sources, the Xiongnu suffered a devastating defeat at the hands of the Han dynastic military towards the end of the 1st century AD. Some scholars have argued that this defeat at the hands of their eastern enemies prompted the Xiongnu to migrate westward, and that ultimately, after several centuries of westward migration, this confederation of Xiongnu tribes arrived at the eastern borders of the European continent. While this theory became extremely popular in the 18th century and has continued in popularity as many desire to attribute Asiatic origins to this force invading Europe, modern advances in archaeology and genetics have proven that this is not necessarily the case. Much of the data derived from these modern advancements is quite damning in disproving this theory of Xiongnu westward migration. The most compelling evidence comes to us from the field of genetics, particularly through the analysis of Y chromosome paternal lineage haplogroups. According to one Chinese study published in the Journal of Human Genetics in 2010 by Zhao and colleagues, the genetic study of skeletons found in 2,500-year-old burials traditionally associated with the Xiongnu culture revealed that Xiongnu skeletons were associated with one of 3 haplogroups, C, D4, and M10. These haplogroups are commonly found amongst modern populations inhabiting Northeast Asia. A more recent study, published by Neparachki and colleagues in 2019, has revealed the Y paternal lineage haplogroups of Hunnic skeletons found in European burial grounds dating to the migration era. Of the 3 Hunnic skeletons examined, the Y haplogroups yielded were Q1A2, R1b, and R1a. These latter 2 haplogroups are particularly interesting as the R1a and R1b haplogroups are known to modern archaeogeneticists as being associated with the paternal lineages that emerged out of the Indo-European expansions throughout Europe and Asia in the late Neolithic and early Bronze Ages. This newfound revelation is quite intriguing. For a long time, scholars of Hunnic history had assumed that their origins lay in the Xiongnu populations of the east, and yet we see here that the male lineage of the Hunnic population seemingly stems from an Indo-European population group. Perhaps then, this population of Huns had a recent shared ancestor with the Germanic, Slavic, or Scythian populations that were still inhabiting the Eurasian steppe at the time. We know that from the numerous historical accounts describing the Huns, a large part of their empire's forces were actually made up of Germanic auxiliaries taken from the various Germanic tribes that were subjugated by the Huns during the early migration era. These reports can be confirmed through archaeology. Archaeological excavations at numerous migration era burial sites that are associated with the Huns have often yielded skeletons that are genetically coded as belonging to a Germanic population. Traditional Germanic burial goods are also a common find at these sites. We also find Germanic women buried alongside Hunnic rulers in their graves, presumably taken as wives or as captives in war. While many of these Hunnic and Germanic skeletons share the same paternal Y haplogroups, the current genetic data available to us does not suggest that the Hunnic nobility were themselves of Germanic origin. As a general observable trend, most Hunnic skeletons are more genetically comparable to the mummies found in the Altai Mountains associated with the Scythian Pazyryk culture. In all likelihood, the Huns were probably most closely related to one of the several Scythian or Iranic populations that lived in the Pontic Caspian steppes at the time of their expansion westward. Interestingly enough, there are several later medieval textual sources that suggest that the Germanic and Nordic populations of Europe considered the Huns to be part of an ethnic group separate to their own. Attila himself appears as a character in several instances of Germanic poetry. Most notable is Attila's appearance as an antagonist in the Germanic Poetic Edda, as well as in the later Middle High German Nibelungenlied. In these sources, he appears as Atli or Etzel, and is the king of the Huns, who takes upon a Germanic wife. At some point in the story, Attila tries to lure the two twin brothers of the wife to a banquet, where he will eventually betray the brothers and slaughter them. The marriage between Attila and his Germanic wife is generally not portrayed in a very positive light, and so when the two brothers arrive and meet with their sister, the sister will give them a warning of Attila's planned treachery. In the Poetic Edda, Attila's men are successful in capturing the two brothers and kill them. As a way of getting revenge, the Germanic wife of Attila then feeds him the flesh of their two sons, whom she had killed. The Nibelungenlied offers a different explanation of the story, in which the two brothers end up actually defeating Attila and his forces, but then the sister herself turns against the two brothers and has them killed for their treachery. While the Nibelungenlied account can be dated to the late medieval period, it is quite clear that the story of Attila in the Poetic Edda stems from a much more ancient source. It is clear that in this more ancient Germanic source, the Huns are not only viewed as a different ethnic group from the Germanics themselves, but the Huns are also viewed as being antagonists to the Germanic heroes of the story. This negative portrayal of the Huns in these Germanic accounts clearly reflects an animosity that the Germanic populations that had expanded throughout Europe in the migration era still had for the population that had subjugated them up until recently. While I am a firm believer that the Huns were likely of a Scythian origin, the name Attila itself seems to be Germanic in origin, though it is unsure whether or not this was the name the ruler actually used to refer to himself, or if this was only the name of the ruler as it was recorded in the Germanic historical accounts of Jordanes. We are ultimately unable to determine exactly which population group they hailed from. The only thing that we can confirm is that they likely originated from a Indo-European genetic source, or at least the Hunnic nobility themselves were Indo-European. According to the textual sources, as well as the burial customs we have observed through archaeology, it seems likely that the Huns themselves practiced a form of sky worship, which, based on their genetic heritage, we can presume to be very similar to the classical sky worship practiced by the Indo-European populations, such as the Yamnaya, back on the ancient steppe. If my theory that the Huns were descended from a Scythian population is correct, then it is likely that the Huns also had a major cult dedicated to the Scythian god of war. Our knowledge of the Scythian god of war is fairly limited and is mostly attributed to the works of the ancient Greek historian Herodotus. In his ethnographic accounts of Scythian culture, Herodotus describes a deity worshipped by the Scythians, whom he refers to as Scythian Ares. According to Herodotus, the Scyths honored this god by offering him cattle and human sacrifices. If my theory is true that the Huns were merely a Scythian tribe that was particularly warlike, it would make a lot of sense that this Scythian Ares was placed in quite high esteem. Perhaps the dedication of the Huns to their god of war could explain why in historical accounts written by Roman Christians, the sword of Attila is referred to as the Sword of Mars, despite the fact that the Roman population had largely converted away from their traditional pagan practices. Ultimately, we can never state anything with certainty when it comes to the culture and religion of the Huns. The little information we do have comes from biased historical sources and from archaeological reconstruction. That being said, the Huns are a fantastic enigma of human history, and perhaps a very late example of traditional Indo-European steppe culture and its influence on the medieval world. While Attila and his Hunnic Empire may have ultimately been unsuccessful in their goal to bring down both of the Roman empires, we can state for certain that the gods of our ancestors were watching down on the exploits of these nomads with great interest, as these mortal men attempted to bring down the schemes and forces of the adversaries in this world. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Son of the North podcast. My name is Rex, and I hope you've enjoyed this momentary escape from the soul-crushing insanity of the Kali Yuga. May the gods bless you and your loved ones in the weeks to come.